Welcome back to the Deepfake Dialogues. Today I'm joined by Alesh Kapp, a PhD researcher at University College London, whose work sits at the intersection of AI, synthetic media, and democratic theory. We're discussing his research on how generative AI threatens electoral integrity, and his provocative argument that rather than just fighting deepfakes, we may need to fundamentally rethink how democracy works in an age of infinite AI-generated content. Let's dive right in. Hi, Alesh. Thank you so much for joining me today. Let's start with your background and personal journey. You previously were a management consultant. What prompted you to return to university for graduate school? And how did you become interested in researching AI's threat to democracy?
Hi, Ashmita. Hello. So I was before I went into work, I was doing my master's at UCL, and I was doing my master's in psychology specifically. And I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with research. I fell in love with academia and what it stood for, and the process. And it kind of just really worked for me. When you've got the feeling that this is right. But ultimately, I also felt that it was probably too soon for me to do a PhD. I wanted to get the contact with the real world of practitioners and industry. And then my supervisor at that point, in the master's program, he recommended boutique consulting. He thought that was a good fit for me. And I trusted him. I went into it, and he was mostly right. It was a really good place. So I worked at this place called Q5, which is this kind of small, medium-sized consultancy in Westminster. And it was a good time. It was a good time for 3 years, but ultimately, I eventually kind of realized that it wasn't quite for me. Like I was a good fit. I enjoyed quite a bit of the work, especially some of the kind of transformation of the NHS that we worked for and a lot of the kind of public sector stuff. I did actually enjoy that. And I found it quite meaningful. But eventually, I did have to conclude that it wasn't entirely for me. It's a place where it's a place for people who are very, very good at doing, and I'm more of someone who likes to pause and think and reflect and really kind of try and see if whatever we're recommending is actually the right thing. And I'm probably just too kind of contemplative for management consulting. It's like it's a race in doing rather than race in thinking. So I was never gonna sort of enjoy that race forever. But ultimately, I just deep down I knew I was going to do a PhD. It's like so basically I was doing consulting for 3 years, and the whole time I basically took it as like a PhD prep period when I was just reading books and I was basically figuring out what my proposal was going to be and where I was going to do my PhD. So people around me always kind of knew that I was eventually going to do a PhD, and it was a good decision. It's like management consulting is it's a tricky ship to jump. They're very good at kind of dangling the carrot of promotion and more interesting work and more money in front of you, and it becomes quite tricky to jump. But luckily, I did manage. So that was the idea. And how did I become interested in the topic? Is that especially, well, again, it goes back to my master's. I wrote my master's thesis on political psychology specifically. So I wrote it on the stuff kind of stuff around Jonathan Haidt, the moral foundations and the righteous mind. How conservatives and liberals kind of perceive the world differently. And I remember I was so fascinated by it, and just this idea that people perceive virtue and truth from completely different perspectives, and you can't really have one thing kind of mutually understood. It just really fascinated me. And then I kind of looked into the world, and you'd have conflicts happening around the world. You'd have big kind of political debates, and suddenly I began noticing that people do use different frames, but people not just use different frames. People rely on different sets of facts, and people, and these you can't sort of merge these facts. Something is either true or it's not. Either in a certain conflict, a certain number of people or died or they didn't. But you had these camps that just couldn't even agree on basic facts, and suddenly I realized, well, if this is the world of social media, what happens when you throw AI into all this? You've got um, this machine that can create infinite content. But we can go into that later. I don't want to get ahead of myself. And I thought, yeah, this is something that I find really important. Let's look into it. And also around the time when I was starting a PhD, deepfakes were like the big thing. It was like just a couple of years before that, Nina Schick wrote that book about deepfakes and hypocrisy, and it was becoming a big deal. So I was like, yeah, let's do this. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah, awesome. And can you explain the impact that generative AI and deepfakes are having on our elections? Will this become worse in the future?
Um, I mean, there's a big debate around this. Like, are deepfakes or kind of synthetic content in general, are they wrecking our elections? And so from the work that we've done, um, and also not just my work. I mean, there's work of the likes of Sam Stockwell at the Alan Turing, who's done amazing work on this, and Phil as well. Um, it looks like so far most elections have been okay when it comes to deepfakes, but I think this comes with really really serious caveats. Um, you do have elections like Slovakia, for instance, which I'm from Czech Republic, so the Slovakian election feels quite important to me, even though I'm not from there. I'm their neighbor. Um, where obviously I think it was like 48 hours before the election, before people actually went to the ballot. Um, this big deepfake came out, so framing one of the candidates as in really awful ways, and there are speculations that a certain part of the population, of the Slovak population, turned up at the election as a result of that deepfake. So that's probably the kind of most egregious example that people usually refer to when they fear deepfakes and elections. That there's going to be this big deepfake, it's going to happen last minute, especially in the period of the kind of the memorandum when media are not actually allowed to report on anything, but on social media this kind of avalanche of slope happens, and suddenly the election is compromised. So that's the biggest example, and we have seen it in Slovakia. We've seen it in a couple other countries. I suppose Argentina comes to mind as well. Argentina was literally labeled as the big deepfake election. But overall, most of the people that really spent a lot of time thinking and looking into this tend to conclude that it hasn't been too bad. So like elections have survived. My big caveat is, well, how could we conclude that the elections have been compromised if researchers don't really have access to platform data? It's like the way to study this is so incredibly not just complicated, but it's restricted. It's we researchers just don't really have access to good data on this. And if we had better data or access to the platform, then perhaps different conclusions could be drawn. Because I think that some of the most serious harms to elections, so some of the kind of potential threat vectors to really undermine the integrity of elections, and whether the elections have legitimacy, whether we should actually kind of take the results seriously, I think are just much less romantic than this kind of egregious example of Slovakia, much more incremental, much more kind of boiling the frog scenario. And often, I mean, if you were an attacker and you were trying to undermine elections, your goal would be to do it in a way that's quite low key, that perhaps only targets a certain part of a population, that doesn't get captured by mass media. Um, so if you were really smart about attacking elections, you would probably do it in a different way. And these ways are much harder to study for researchers nowadays. Um, so that brings me to this much bigger point, which is that the scenarios through which elections could be undermined are just much more varied, and a lot of them, I would argue, have to do with incremental change, kind of moving of the Overton window, and just slowly bringing people further and further apart from each other, rather than just kind of plonking or dumping a deepfake into the sphere and hoping that it'll wreak some sort of damage. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and so you've worked on a paper called Safeguarding Elections in the Age of AI and Synthetic Content, in which you propose a framework for electoral integrity. So could you just explain that and what this paper is about?
Yeah. So this work we wrote this with one of my supervisors, Sarah Jeff Mulligan, and the idea was very simple. The idea was we didn't think that an institution existed that would protect elections from deepfakes specifically, and synthetic media in general. Um, so that was our kind of beginning. That was our starting intuition. And then our ambition for the paper was basically to look around, look at existing institutions, see if any of them are doing a particularly good job. So we looked around the world. We looked at French Visionum, we looked into Sweden, we looked into Taiwan, we looked into the Philippines, and we kind of looked around the world, and we learned from some of the institutions because some of them are doing a phenomenal job. But ultimately, we concluded that there wasn't an institution that kind of managed to really tackle the problem itself, the problem kind of in its entirety. So what we did, we kind of diagnosed what the problem is. We looked at some of the kind of existing empirical evidence, some theoretical evidence as well, and we really kind of try and get to the bottom of what is the essence of the threat. The essence is quite simple, actually. I mean, anyone who has seen generative AI or has used it understands this. The problem is that it's capable of generating immense volumes of content at breakneck speed in a way that's micro-targeted to people. I think those are the kinds of the three pillars of the threat. It's just loads. This like is this what we call it? Well, in my head I call it the infinite content machine. Um, it's just it can create so much content, and there's this from now several years ago, from 3 years ago, there's a perfect example that gets this called the countercloud. I don't know if you've come across that, but the countercloud was an artist really experimenting with the technology, and they spent I think about $500 on trying to automate the end-to-end kind of influence campaign. So from generation of the media to creation of this kind of botnet style network of fake profiles on social media to then disseminating it and kind of having really the end-to-end of what you'd usually accuse kind of Russian style influence campaigns of doing. That artist made that happen for about $500. Um, and so something that historically would require a lot of not just kind of money sort of funding, but also a lot of human resource. Suddenly, with that technology, it was demonstrated that you were able to make that happen for about 500 quid. Um, and that's like several years ago, and the technology really, really has progressed since. So the threat is very real. If we see this deployed in our media system, that is potentially catastrophic for the legitimacy of elections. So we kind of diagnosed this problem, and then, as I said, we looked around the institutional landscape. What is actually out there? Again, the conclusion was there isn't really anything that would quite get it perfectly from our perspective. But if you kind of look across the entire palette, if you borrow a little bit from the French, you borrow a little bit from the Lithuanians, you borrow a little bit from the Philippines and Taiwan, you can actually really get to a fairly comprehensive solution. And so we try and do that. We basically spell out what that institution would do. And I don't think I need to go, well, I shouldn't really go into too much detail because it's quite a niche, specialized interest that Jeff and I share about institutional design. Yeah, but the idea is you end up with an institution that countries around the world could actually get inspired by and could actually implement in their own way. Obviously, it's going to look different in, for instance, India than it would in the UK. But you've got this blueprint, this kind of speculative piece of design that countries can actually adopt. And we've had some very interesting feedback from people around the world, and hopefully we will see that adopted more and more. But yeah, that's the idea.
Awesome. Okay, so you're now working on your doctoral thesis. Can you explain what this is and and how this relates to deepfakes and their impact on democracy?
Yeah, sure. So I think, well, a good place to start is elections and deepfakes because that's where my work kicked off when I was in my first year. I did a pilot study asking people, what do you think deepfakes are going to do to elections? And that's when I was able to pick up some of the people's wisdom about it not being just about the kind of egregious Slovakian example, but it about more perhaps about being um, about the kind of erosion of the shared world, the kind of the shared mental reality that people have, the kind of what I call the epistemic floor, kind of the common ground of facts and sensibilities that people need to have a meaningful political debate. But ultimately, what I realized quite quickly doing this work is that it's not just about elections and it's not just about deepfakes. So I think deepfakes, if you really want to study this comprehensively, you need to broaden the focus from deepfakes to synthetic content in general, because ignoring text and is just I think really unwise, because a lot of the threat vectors to democratic functions still happen through text, not just kind of this multimodal deepfake style content. Um, and you also need to broaden the focus or the scope from elections to democracy more general, because democracy is not just elections. And actually, I would argue that that's one of the biggest mistakes that we make in the society, that we conflate elections with democracy. Democracies need to. There's a lot more civic involvement and a lot more kind of parliamentary. There's so much happening in democracy that actually makes it a democracy. So elections, they're a good starting point, and they were a really good starting point for me. But I think the scope really needed to be broadened. So, but that's where I started. Okay, elections, deepfakes, what's going to happen? Okay, it's not looking great. What can we do about it? Um, but then I became really fascinated with this idea. If we have this infinite content machine, and it's kind of it's been unleashed into society, so you've got this tool that can just create infinite content at crazy speeds, and it can tailor it to micro target people. How is that going to impact the world? How is that going to impact democracy specifically? So, um, I mean, you can imagine what that would be like for you. I can imagine what that would be like for me. Even these days we listen to our podcasts. We have our timelines. I mean, as a sort of as a political act, I've actually excommunicated myself from Instagram and the like. So actually, I don't have a timeline, but sometimes I'll go on the kind of generic YouTube, for instance, to check out what people are seeing these days. But you can imagine, you've got your own tailored timeline already. So what would happen if really this timeline was fueled not by human content but by AI content, and it was just this infinite stream of media. Um, so the question I became really fascinated by is, what will that do to the public sphere? This political discourse that every democracy needs to be healthy, to be legitimate as well. So the whole idea of elections, basically, regardless of which political theorist you read, whether it's Habermas or whether it's Chantal Mouffe, they disagree on so many things, but they all kind of agree that you need you need reasonably healthy political debate, and you need to be able to establish some facts and some values and some sensibilities. Some people like John Rawls called it the overlapping consensus. You may disagree on interpretations, you may disagree on certain facts, but at least we need to agree on some things that make our debate reasonable. And so my big chapter in my thesis is about trying to look ahead into the future and try and anticipate what AI is going to do to that. And the way we do that, I mean, we use these kind of really interesting fancy futures methods, like futures literacy, and we look into people's anticipatory assumptions, which are just these assumptions that people make about the future, and we try and sort of work with these to dissect what could the future really look like. Because ultimately, um, we have an awful track record as a society with anticipating how technology is going to affect us and how it's going to unfold and how it's going to be implemented. Like, my favorite example, for instance, is um, the one of telephone. So when telephone was invented, initially there was this like aggressive consensus that it was only going to be used for basically stock market purposes. People were sort of saying silly stuff like, "Oh, I would never want to listen to my friends breathe into my ear. That's like the proximity is ridiculous. That's like so ugly. I don't want to talk to call my partner and hear them breathing. Here we are. They were wrong. People love calling. Well, some people love calling their friends and their partners. So it's just the we tend to make assumptions about the future that tend to be outdated or too linear, or just we're not very good at really fathoming the complexity and the kind of the beautiful variety of the future. So one of my projects is about trying to anticipate what AI is going to do to the public sphere.
So you just talked about how predicting the future with how technology is going to progress is extremely difficult. How are you going about doing this with your current research?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question because I owe a lot of this perspective, and I would almost dare call it wisdom, to my supervisor Ina Steenmans, um, she's a associate professor in futures. Um, the way we think about the future, I think, is a very interesting topic in and of itself, and a lot of the current world relies on the word prediction a lot. So people are trying to predict the future, and especially if you focus, I don't know if you spent any time engaging with the kind of AI safety discourse on the internet and in the kind of professional spheres. So much of it is about just simple prediction. So we have all these like AGI timelines, that are saying we're going to reach AGI by 2028, and then some other people come in and they say, now we're going to reach AGI by 2029, and then someone else comes in and now 2027 we're going to reach AGI. All about is that they're just trying to kind of out predict each other. Um, and basically our stance is quite different to this. Our stance is the future just doesn't exist yet. And so much could happen that will shape the future. So much of our action will shape the future. And there is very little point trying to predict it. But what we could do instead is we could try and anticipate it. So we could try and look into the future, kind of evaluate the future from different angles. What if we look at it from this perspective? What if we look at it from this perspective? What if we change this idea? And then what does the future tell us about how we need to act now? So I think specifically for AI policymaking and for things like building institutions that protect elections, I actually find this perspective much more useful, because if you're trying to predict the future, you're quite likely to get something wrong. I would argue you're extremely likely to get something wrong. And then you've committed to these designs and to these policy solutions. And then you're thinking, oh, damn it, okay, well, this isn't quite right, and we have to change everything. Whereas if you anticipate and you really involve people in the process, you're making decisions with the kind of acceptance of uncertainty and what some people in academia call deep uncertainty. So the way we do that, and this is a methodology we've been working on for a while, and I can't wait to actually see how it works, is about anticipatory assumptions. So this is rooted in Real Miller's work at UNESCO. Real Miller being the person behind it, called Futures Literacy Labs. It's this phenomenal process. I would wish to everyone to experience it and then see how it actually works, because is this idea that you try and surface the assumptions that you make about the future. And we all do. So for instance, I may be assuming that democracy will always run on elections, and there's, elections equal democracy and there's no alternative. You may assume that, we will always abide by kind of globalized financial markets. You may assume, that there are so many things we may assume. There was an example actually I read about just yesterday in this book called Seeing Like a Platform. Great book, by the way. Where they're talking about the kind of the hopeful visions people had for the internet and social media. They were thinking, yeah, social media is going to be amazing for us because. But ultimately, they all make assumptions about the future, and then it turned out the assumptions were wrong. They missed the fact, these people that were so hopeful about these social media platforms potentially being amazingly democratizing, they missed this fact that venture capital came in and they realized that platforms like Uber can begin to control the markets. They can get quite malicious about extracting value from it, and suddenly, oh damn, well, this isn't as democratizing as we initially hoped. So again, there's this assumption that's embedded in people's visions of the future, and they don't even know that they're making that assumption. So we think that there is immense value in actually surfacing these assumptions and then trying to disrupt them. So if I'm thinking about the future as this, like, so my vision of the future is as, one that's always going to revolve around elections. What if I imagine the future without elections? What would that future actually look like? And then what can I learn from that? So if we look across all these assumptions that we're making, perhaps as a group or as a big collective, what's happening across all these futures once we've actually been able to disrupt our assumptions? So is this, at the core, it's like this kind of, I think of it as a slightly more sophisticated way of treating the future. That's why it's called futures literacy, because Real Miller has always argued that people who are capable of doing this are more future literate. So that's I suppose that's a lot of kind of futures niche specialized detail, but that's how we're aiming to do it. So it's less about predicting and more about anticipating.
Yeah, and I'm actually curious, what are some of these assumptions, like if elections are not due to AI and or become untenable, what other methods are there?
Oh, okay, big question. Question. I mean, this is really the big idea behind what's been kind of driving my interest in this. So I think I have to caveat this. I think there's loads of amazing initiatives that are trying to safeguard our media system. So like content credentials is one of them from Adobe. When they cryptographically embed these kind of these content labels, and it travels with the piece of content through the internet. I think that is a phenomenal effort and really important. You've got companies like, I've just met someone from the company called ProRata, where they're trying to sort of track back the distribution of the training content into the output of the AI, and then they're thinking of how to distribute the income from it if it's used in the media system. You've got all these really, really clever, thoughtful, important initiatives. But what I'm thinking is there has to come a point when we realize that perhaps we're swimming against the tide here. And perhaps eventually we have to start adapting our political system rather than just trying to improve this media system. So, well, do you think? Let me ask you a quick question. Do you think that in 25 years' time, we're going to bother about trying to identify whether a piece of content is AI created or just 100% human created? Do you think we're going to care in 20, 30 years' time?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. This actually reminds me of a discussion I had a few episodes ago with philosopher Joshua Hapgood-Koot, who was talking about how deepfakes, how we've assumed that video content is true. Like, what we see in a video has happened, when we can no longer assume. First of all, that assumption relied on the integrity of the videographer, and if you're watching TV, like a bunch of middlemen who are like the video editor, like everyone who's sort of interacting with the video before you see it. So that assumption was based on the belief that those people are all, are trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
But now that we have deepfakes and it's so easy to create one, it's really changing people's inherent assumptions that what they see in a video or in an image is automatically like the reality. So I think we'll slowly, our social norms will change to the point where we won't, when we see like a piece of content or video or an image, audio clip, we won't automatically believe it to be the reality of it, or and so we'll stop making automatic assumptions inherently about media
Hmm.
as like a way to look at what's really happened, and instead we'll sort of view all media content with suspicion.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I
that'll
mean, so
really change, yeah, other than official channels of communication from like politicians and other people, that will change how we get information and what we trust. And that'll definitely have an effect on our democratic like discourse
yeah,
for sure.
yeah, yeah. No, I would agree with you. I mean, the funny thing about this is that like very little about this is totally new. Like Susan Sontag, she famously wrote about photography, and there's that photo of the guy in the Spanish War, and that photo was actually taken somewhere completely different, and then that was a big deal. It's like we've had the same sort of panic about photography, and we've had the same sort of panic about TV. So when it comes to TV disrupting the public sphere, that was a big deal. People are sort of freaking out about how that's going to turn all political discourse into just this kind of competition entertainment, and how that's going to disrupt our democracies. Has it? Well, maybe a little bit. I don't know. We can debate that, but so very little about this is really really new, and I think the historical perspective is very important. Um, but yet, I would caution that there's something about AI that really is a step change. That really is a big kind of shift in the paradigm. And now, as you said, we're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to figure out how to actually deal with this. And perhaps we can try tweak around the edges of the technology, so we can try and bring in safeguards, so we can think about the kind of the infrastructure of the media system in general. Some people have argued, like, so Alan Rennick at UCL, for instance, in the Constitution Unit, he's argued that we need to set up this portal for political information. So when it comes to elections and, kind of election campaigns, I mean, he's arguing we just need this hub of political information where people can go that they can trust. I think potentially, yeah, I think a great idea. Actually, in a lot of my research, people have been suggesting that. So there seems to be this kind of resonance in people's minds about this. But yet, I don't see that as a satisfactory solution. I think if really you have, and again, I'm making assumptions about what the future is going to look like, but my assumption is that people's informational diets will be so individualized and so micro targeted and just so disparate from each other, so scattered and so unconnected, that we really need to think about what the right political decision making process is. Elections probably will struggle in that. And that's when later on we'll go into, deliberative political processes. But what I'm trying to say here is that I think we're swimming against the tide, but equally, perhaps AI really is very different to social media. So again, you can probably hear my assumptions. Like I'm assuming that AI will just continue the trend from social media. So we've had TV come in; it's become more individualized. We've had all these kinds of new types of media cropping up on the internet, and so kind of the Gramscian distinction between kind of mass consensus creating media and these kind of antagonistic media. So we've had more of the antagonistic, like Joe Rogan podcast style. I mean, this is probably an antagonistic style of media, your podcast itself, because there's very little editorial oversight. There's very little kind of centralized oversight of what information gets published, what gets censored out. It's just everyone can start a podcast. Everyone can go out there and talk to people, which in many ways is amazing. But what I think we've realized over the past perhaps 15 years is that the way the platforms actually control the discourse is much more significant than most people originally hoped. So my question kind of to the world really would be, yeah, when do we start thinking about what the right political decision making systems are in this kind of media world, in a media world where everyone just has their own informational diet, and it's just, and who actually controls that diet? Like, I'm digressing here, but I think this is a really important thought. the AI models are very, very different from social media. Like they represent a completely different paradigm. It's not this like metaphor of this complex fractal decentralized network. It's very different. I mean, the large language models infrastructure is like that. We call these different nodes, but ultimately there is this company behind it that controls it. They can play with the system prompts. They can play with the training. They can set up reward functions. It's like, I think in many ways it is quite centralized, and I can imagine a future, for instance, wherein we agree as a society what common ground has to exist within everyone's media diet. And like this is a really, really terrifying idea, because if if that kind of decision is made undemocratically, so if, for instance, if Elon Musk, with Grok, decides, I think everyone's informational diet that's being pumped into their heads through my model has to say X, Y. I mean, I don't want to go into specifics what Elon Musk would dictate for his models to actually kind of include, but everyone who uses that model would share that common ground, because that model would be determining their informational diet. If that is done undemocratically, oof, holy shit, that is really, really scary. But if that is done democratically, and for instance, we can agree that um, informational diet will sort of drip feed a little bit of appreciation for the rule of law, and it will, these kind of human rights. I mean, these things have to be challenged every now and then. There has to be dissent. But I think the balance between kind of bridging consensus and dissent has to be gotten right. And I perhaps would argue that in the world of social media, and this is commentary, this is not my kind of research perspective, but this is just my opinion. I would argue that the world of social media has driven the dissent too far, and has dialed down the kind of consensus seeking. So I'm scared of hegemonic ideas as the next man, but I think we really need to think carefully about this balance.
As I understand it, the second part of your doctoral thesis is about AI-enabled mass deliberation. Can you explain what that is and what we can
Yeah,
gain through it?
yeah, of course. Just to be clear about how this all hangs together. So my entire thesis is basically about AI and democracy. And on one hand, you've got how AI could potentially act as a disruptor of the public sphere. And on the other hand, you've got how AI could enrich the public sphere, how it could perhaps kind of fortify it. So we've talked a lot about AI as a disruptor and how we can anticipate that, but um, I should say more about how AI could help. Um, and the key concept that we're really excited about is the one of mass deliberation. So deliberative democracy, deliberation, it means different things to a lot of people, but ultimately the idea is that citizens are involved in political decisions. The most famous example of that has been, or have been, citizen assemblies. I don't know if most people probably understand what citizen assemblies are, but I should kind of recap it quickly. It's this idea that you chuck a certain number of people in a room, let's say 100 people, you put a lot of thought into that sample of people being very representative. So there's like a lot of very clever mathematics, sortition, initiatives that make sure that everyone's voice is represented in that room. And then you facilitate the conversation across a long period of time. You bring you bring experts in with different opinions, different viewpoints. But at the end of the day, it's the people, it's the citizens synthesizing all that information, debating it, talking about it, and at the end, coming up with recommendations and conclusions. And like, when you really read into how these citizen assemblies work, it is very much like whiskey in a barrel to me. So me and my partner, we went to a whiskey distillery when we were in Scotland, and the guy kind of taking us through the tour, he was like, yeah, we just put the whiskey in a barrel and we don't really know what happens, but it happens, and it's this magic that comes out the other end. And to me, citizen assemblies are a bit like that. When you hear, for instance, about the Irish Citizen Assembly, about it was gay marriage and abortion rights that they did. So you can imagine how that could go terribly, terribly wrong in a deeply Catholic country and deeply kind of religiously torn country, not torn, but kind of conflicted country. That could go really, really wrong. But then you actually listen to how that citizen assembly went, and it was a tremendous, tremendous success. Um, and people agreed on things and people agreed to disagree, but it was so totally depolarized. It was really unbelievable. And same to Iceland, deciding their constitutional changes, and it's this phenomenally depolarizing process that seems to work really, really well. And we've got a lot of data from similar things like deliberative polls from Stanford, and the Stanford also have this big kind of deliberation platform. The data is really suggesting that the capability of this process to depolarize and to drive constructive conversation as opposed to destructive and polarizing conversation is just phenomenal. So I think in this kind of media landscape that we spelled out, um, especially if AI really comes in the way we anticipate it to, this is a decision-making process that needs to be taken seriously, and it has been. But there are challenges. The challenges are that it's quite expensive. So local councils, for instance, despite their best intentions, have struggled with kind of actually getting the right traction, getting people involved and kind of making it happen. So it's been the resource has been tricky. But ultimately there's this problem of legitimacy. Democratically, a lot of people would argue the problem is that if you only have a few hundreds of people making a decision for the entire country, it's not very legitimate. You need some kind of mass involvement of people to really legitimize the decisions that are made. And that's when mass deliberation comes in. So mass deliberation is basically just a citizen assembly, but like scaled up to potentially millions of people. And the point is that AI could help with that. It's the nature of the essence of AI, the way it can facilitate conversation, the way it can bring certain pieces of information, and the way it can kind of summarize and synthesize conversations. It's like the promise of AI. As much as I would argue, a lot of people just tend to over-promise on what AI can actually do. I think it has limitations, technological limitations that need to be taken seriously. But the idea is, we could do this on scale. We could do this on incredible scale, involving potentially millions of people. And now, really, the challenge is, can we design that and can we actually introduce it into our political system? So certain suggestions have been made, like, for instance, the way Parliament has green papers. So, like, green paper policy consultations. If there's a bill coming in, some of the bills have a green paper stage. So that's before the white paper stage, where it's just kind of the initial seed, the initial kernel of the idea of the policy of the bill is spelled out. I think people should be allowed to come in and just really debate and deliberate what this bill should do, what it shouldn't do, and the reasons for that are there's so many reasons why I think that should be a good thing. I mean, there's the kind of epistemic promise of, well, if we involve loads of people, we actually tap into this collective intelligence, and the policies will be more bulletproof. They'll be kind of more sophisticated. They'll be more rounded. But also, I think there's a much more important reason to do this, which is solidarity and depolarization and just kind of nurturing of the public sphere. We can't just if someone is passionate about a policy. So for someone it could be climate change policy, for someone it could be policy around tech regulation, for someone it could be about agriculture. There's so many different people are passionate about different policies. They have to be allowed to come in and take part in those debates. Now that we have the technology that enables that, people have to be able to come in, chip in, and not just chip in, but also listen to other viewpoints. Just so the amazing thing about the Stanford Deliberation platform is that you have to sit and listen to other people talk. You hear their stories. You hear that someone else's perspective is different to yours. They have this lived experience that just clashes with yours, and it's different. And you just sit there and you develop sympathy and you develop empathy and compassion. It's like when it comes to the diagnosis of the problem, as we talked about the media system being corrupted and potentially even getting worse, I think this is a way to go. This is a way to improve people's kind of democratic education opportunities, potentially make our policies stronger, and just defend, kind of shelter our political system from some of the pathologies of the media system as it has been and as it quite possibly will be. So yeah, I'll end it there.
Thank you, Alesh. This was a really intriguing discussion. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Ashmita. Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deepfake Dialogues. If you found this conversation insightful, please follow and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out. See you in the next episode.